Sup everybody, and welcome to a Walk in the Walk game design and open world discussion video. This is an older video for Mafia 3, but I had some issues with the editing as well as older sound, older voice samples, and I wanted to get those in here, post it, clean it up, and get it out for you guys, especially as I'm doing more walking the walks in the future. I figured a lot of people who've been following the channel may not know about these kind of videos. So sit on back, and again, this will change slightly in the audio tone because this is an older video. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you get a chance. In a lot of these, I always have to decide, hey, where do I want to start? Well, the South, I think, for me, was a great place to start the game. Number one, it's not as explored as the other areas, especially in trailers and Let's Plays. But two, there's really some interesting stuff. For example, this lighthouse that I'm going to take you guys to really intrigued me because, as you guys know, that when you create a game, many times you are using realistic and real places and then adjusting them for your fantasy, basically, for your fantasy world. And here we see a lighthouse that in many ways reminds me of the Chifuncta lighthouse that's on the river there in New Orleans. And it's, you know, this is a lighthouse that's been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times in real life. Now, there are some differences here. The crosshatches supports are different. The main base location is different. But there's something about it that really resonates artistically with that original lighthouse, at least when it comes to its location, which is very much a mirror image of where the Chifuncta lighthouse is, but also just its overall setup and even the technology used. Now, I was surprised you can't hear any generator working, but there is no power actually coming here. There is a riser that I noticed, but there's actually no power lines coming here, and I did check underneath. And of course, you have to look at something and say, you know, artistically, maybe they just chose not to do that. But I love the fact that this almost looks like a commercial lighthouse out here, maybe run on a generator and just, you know, making sure that ships don't crash kind of thing, but just somebody took it over. And what's even more interesting is there's never anybody here. And so it always feels like this strange, haunted, abandoned lighthouse. And each time I've come in and go through this town, I'm always surprised at the lack of NPCs. Now, that'll be something that we discuss as an actual problem with the title as well, or at least I would say a real weakness. But it is and does here offer this slight feeling of almost mystery. So let's listen to the sound here for a second. So just a little bit about that. First of all, I actually really like some of the layering of sound that they've done here. We do know that, of course, because there are 10 districts, the developers went out and they got their audio engineers and they recorded different sounds from various locations that mimicked these. And most of those locations were site specific. So you would say New Orleans versus New Bordeaux. They went to New Orleans and they did try to find some sounds that were in some way reminiscent of it. But I do like the way in which they're handling their sound layering, which is a little bit different, not completely different than everybody else, but at least the way they described it and the system they built, which was proprietary, is quite interesting. And basically what it is it's a background, midground, foreground kind of mixing. If you assume that all of your sounds within the ambient environment belong in one of those places, your background, your midground, and your foreground, and then what happens is almost like a 3-lane highway. In fact, in many ways, like the 2-lane highway of game design I've talked about, where you have gameplay and overall story that both need to carry the game forward. Here, you have 3 lanes of sound. You have your background, your midground, and your foreground. And as you move throughout the game, those can be mended in and can be faded in and out at any time and completely separate of one another. So almost like when you put a fade in between 2 parts of a video, getting some of the previous frames of the last part of the video and some of the new frames of the new one and mending them together, you're doing the same with audio. So as you move from a rural area to an urban one, let's say, you maybe decide you're not going to fade out the crickets until later, of course, because they're a long throw sound, but you're going to remove some of the overall wind over the water sound because you won't be able to hear that, because as you enter into the city streets, that'll be cut off. Very cool, a really good system. It doesn't work perfect, and I'm certainly not here to tell you that everything's perfect in this game, but overall, I really like it. Now, some people may look at this and go, hey, it's running at 30 frames. I apologize. That is absolutely on purpose. Running this at 60 frames on multiple different computers, and then also recording across the top, it just had a couple issues with that injection, and no matter what, I was getting some crashes. So I figured 30 frames to get it done. So back on sound for a second, audio director Matt Bauer and Hayden Blackman, who sort of oversaw it all, really did, I think, do a pretty good job here with the audio layering. But one thing I do have to say is, in many ways, Mafia 3 feels like a beta. Now, I'm not talking about the bugs, because we do see bugs in games, and that's sort of, to me, a separate issue. I'm talking more about the gameplay issues themselves and locations and how they're utilized. In fact, when you look at a title like Mafia 3, it inherently draws some kind of comparison with, let's say, a GTA 5. That's completely normal. And both games handle their rural areas pretty poorly. They don't do the greatest job in sort of elevating those areas to the urban locations, to where you feel like there's actual activity going on. And even though you end up basically doing more in this district later, it never really catches on. It never really catches fire. But what happens is, especially during that time, you start to notice the lack of interactivity even more so in these areas. And you know, I absolutely love this location. I think it's beautiful. I think that it is easily one of my favorite rural locations in the game. There's just so little to do and so little interactivity that I think that's when you start picking up on issues, because these problems continue on in the urban areas, which I'll go to in a second. But I love this location. This is so great looking. No colors allowed. It is so great looking and so interesting and varied. The fact that you don't spend a good deal of time here is really almost criminal. A bit ago, I was talking about the different layering of the midground and foreground and background, and talking about the different lanes in which those sort of are presented. When it comes down to it, you also have the same with gameplay and story. And I've talked about this before, the two-lane idea of gameplay, that basically a game, to be a success, or to at the very least not feel bumpy, needs to make sure that the two lanes of its activity are completely at all times being utilized. So that means your gameplay and your story. And the easiest way to describe this is that both of them need to continue from start to finish to carry 100% of the plot forward, or 100% of the game forward from start to finish. Now that means that story might drop down to 10% of the actual game, while gameplay is at 90%. And we see that with some open world games with a lot of collectibles, or even just a lot of really cool side missions. And then we see the opposite of that, where you might have a Telltale game where a lot of times story is 90% and gameplay is 10%. And that's also fine, as long as people understand what they're getting into. And additionally, it's supported by really good overall gameplay mechanics and story mechanics. Those are all very important. And I think what we see in Mafia 3 is a little bit of a front load there. And it's unfortunate, because I've talked about my issue personally with, let's say, Let's Plays or quick looks, where you notice that games that are inherently front loaded can appear differently than they really are for the consumer who gets them home. And this can go the opposite route, where it can be better as it goes forward. For example, a game like State of Decay, which ignoring the fact that it also, like Mafia 3, is just inherently buggy, it actually has multiple systems that unlock many hours upon hours upon hours into the game. And the overall idea of a quick look or a quick Let's Play, watching a couple walkthroughs to decide on your purchase, would be inherently really dangerous for those titles. And I think we're seeing that. And unfortunately, we see it in Mafia 3, where you go to some of the outskirts in Mafia 3 and you notice a little less and less is done. But those initial parts with the big storyline and all that are sort of immediately in your face, and you notice it, and then they thin out as it moves on. And it's sort of one of those situations where I guess it could be easily compared to a movie, where in the middle, it's just not being held up, I think, as strongly as it should be. And the end, while good, allows you to actually notice the problems in the middle and makes them even more noticeable. So, of course, as I said, I won't talk about graphics too much, but I do want to talk about the night and day and the dynamics of the weather system. You know, many games, when they create their illumination system and when they go at their lighting system and they try to decide what they're going to do, they have to decide between a static lighting system and one that's dynamic. And of course, in Mafia 3, it makes sense to go dynamic. You have your day and night transitions, and of course, you have your different weathers. However, in a strange way, it actually looks like at one time this was originally planned to be a very static lit area, a very static lit world. In fact, one of the reasons why is because, as you guys have noticed, when weather starts up, the game completely loses its shit. And graphically, there's a lot of errors. There's a lot of overall problems with bloom and lighting and the weather effects themselves not interacting with the game world. It actually looks like the dynamic system was pasted on top of a static system. And sadly, what that's resulted in is a system that at sometimes looks really, really good, but whenever anything dynamic comes into it, it really falls down hard. And it's noticeable by any gamer, which really is pretty rare when you think about it. I'm going to go ahead and get us a little bit forward here. So as we know in games, usually what they'll have is a visual focal point every so often. What this has done is so that almost in any open world game, wherever you look, there's something incredibly interesting to see. This is pretty much development 101. This is something that most people understand. Even on a 2D game, you always want somebody looking forward. You always want a reason for a gamer to look forward visually. And especially in an open world game, that makes even more sense. But one of the reasons why, as I've spoken in the past about feeling it's a little bit like a beta, it's because a lot of the interaction that should be there is gone. You know, if you really think about gaming, and if you think about a game itself as sort of a layer of the interactivity on top of different places that you can go, if that interactivity is less than you expect, it can feel a little jarring. We saw that in GTA 5 even. But here in Mafia 3, we see an even more unique system of problems. For example, not being able to go up here in the middle of nowhere is one situation. But when I go into the city, I'll show you some locations where there are places you can go into, but you can't actually do anything, which I think we start to see those problems. Now, actually, this is a really good place to look at the sound errors when it comes to some of the layering. Let's listen. So I've spoken about some of the sound errors that exist in Mafia prior. One of the things that it's doing is it's messing up the layering here, and it's keeping the frogs but removing things like cars and then adding them back in. You can hear it actually fudging with itself and trying to figure out what to do. But additionally, you have an issue where they've taken the sound sphere. Now, the sound sphere is usually what you impact and what you can hear within the sound, and they've taken it from the character and put it on the camera. Now, if you wanted a larger sound sphere, what you would do is you would make sure that it existed a little bit past the character's face and all the way behind the camera. So you have a larger sound sphere, but it still seems somewhat realistic. Here, what we actually see is the entire sound sphere is based around the camera, and that can result in sounds that make absolutely no sense for the main character to hear or not hear. So what I did is jumped us forward into an urban area, because what I want to do is walk around here and show you some of the urban areas and how the debris systems within the game work, and just overall how the world building works. You know, if you consider, and we'll discuss obviously a little bit about interaction as well, but if you consider a game world, the base level game Earth itself, and then you consider debris systems, small things like bottles and stuff like that, and then you consider actor systems with people and NPCs and characters, and then you consider the buildings, and you have to put all those together. Now, there are various different ways you can do it. You can do it hand built, where every single item is placed by hand. You can do kit built, where there are sort of kits that are created. You can almost call it lot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. So you have lot 1, which is a type of building with maybe different debris that's been put on it, different items that have been put on it. And then each time you place that down, the game randomizes that and puts it down for you and tries to sort of make sure that nothing appears to be exactly like something else. And what we have here is a situation where it really looks like a lot of it is hand dropped. And if that's not true, they did a really good job, because I talk about this all the time, the debris systems, past, present, past. I want to make sure that the debris systems, it reflect the location and reflect the people around them to make you really feel like something occurred prior to you getting there and something may occur after you leave. Debris systems are a fantastic way of doing that. A lot of people would see a pile of bottles and say, okay, that's just a pile of bottles. But to a player who's experiencing an open world title, many times your brain can look at that and go, I wonder who was here drinking, that kind of thing. Now, a lot of people may say, well, I just take those for granted. The fact is that many times a system taken for granted when removed is most instantly noticed by game players. And so you have to make sure that those are just absolutely nailed down. And they've done a fantastic job. Everything from the wood here leaning up against the side of the building to just different bits here and there that always make you feel like something has occurred here and gives you a feeling and presence of history within the title. And I think that that organic feeling is done very well in Mafia 3. In fact, to me, the architectural flexibility that you see in Mafia 3 is easily its highlight. In fact, as I stated prior, there's a couple issues here because you have this incredible variety of architecture and this almost organic feel. Look at this. Everything is rounded. There's, I mean, even as much as, or even more so than, let's say, a GTA, you have this feeling of organic chemistry within the game world where things were just sort of built the way they really are in real life. And then you have a situation where 99% of the things that you see, you can't can't interact with. But when you can interact, it actually is sort of jarring. You have a situation where maybe you can go inside of a store, but you can't buy anything. And your brain's like, well, why am I able to even go inside anyway? And I think, again, that sort of points to the fact that, like I said, I feel like this game just needed a couple more months. I love the verticality here. This is so great. This is an awesome looking place, and it sort of fires up your brain. Even if you're a game player who just goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, maybe you won't notice this stuff, but somebody who wants to walk around a game world, they notice that. Oh, so here's something cool. So the NPC systems, they're fairly basic like any open world game, but I love the fact that these guys actually come and go on breaks, and you can see them here. I'd be so pissed, but I'm gonna push these guys around and get them so they'll go back to work, which is awesome. If it were me and I was taking my 10-minute break and I was eating that bologna sandwich my wife, who just came down with cancer, made me, I'd be so pissed. I'd be like, what are you doing? But it's great that you can do that, and you can reset them, and they will go and do various odd jobs. You know, we've talked about this before about NPC states and just how they interact with the game world. Basically, a state could be something like talking to character next to me, and the actor, that's all they're doing. They're taking those emotes and they're doing whatever they may do. But you see situations like this where I destroy stuff. One of the problems I have is that Mafia doesn't really take into account what you're doing very much. It takes into account the racial modifier, obviously, but it's almost like they concentrated too much on that, because other than the guns and so forth, they really don't do anything like that. Like you would assume somebody would be running out there and be like, what the hell are you doing, man? But they rarely do.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Again, you just have one of those situations where there's just enough breaking up your vision that you want to continue, and you were like, you know what, I'll try to get out of here. Let me walk around this corner, those kind of things, and you see, or what looks like somebody stealing, back then, it wouldn't even be cable, it'd be bunny ears. One thing I noticed, Watch Dogs does a good job, GTA 5, of course, and Mafia 3 does a fairly good job as well, of bridge living, under a bridge, beside a bridge, that urbanization that occurs right near a bridge, and how those homes are a little bit more downtrodden. Of course, you have sound pollution and different things like that. And one of the things I suggest to people, if you like just walking around game worlds, check out Mafia 3, check out GTA 5. Both of those do a tremendous job showing you locations. If you get a chance, go under something, go near where railroad tracks are, and you'll actually see that they took a lot of, they took a lot of time to make sure that there's a little bit of accuracy and real life reflection going on there. So jump us forward a little bit. I want to do a little bit of drive into a new location. One thing I noticed while driving in Mafia 3, and I was actually pretty impressed by it, is the fact that a lot of the cars and a lot of the vehicles, a lot of the people, the pedestrians, all actually obey those limits fairly well, which once again makes me wonder if this beta style software that we got in the alpha, would you have been in trouble for speeding? Because we do notice that some things seem half put together. You get the cops that stare at you, but they don't really do anything. You can still, drive straight through those stoplights, which I know a lot of Mafia 2 fans were quite upset with. As we drive here, I just have to say, the driving is pretty locked down. It's fairly good. I was really impressed with how it overall handled, and I was able to do what I needed to do. But I was really disappointed with what you could get away with, and I felt that while it may have been there for a gameplay element, while it may have been planned from a gameplay side where people looked at it and said, you know what, we can't do this, people won't like this, I still feel that this is probably one of the best transportation models that I've seen within an open world game. People doing exactly what they need to do. Even parking, even when you get on top of a car, they don't really have that typical panic attack that we see in a lot of games. Now, that doesn't mean the driving's perfect. In fact, many times there are mess ups, but I still think that there's a law and order kind of situation going on here, and NPCs being held accountable for it, and yet we don't really see the player. And I would really have liked to have seen that sort of come to fruition, but it's unfortunate. So I'm going to drive to a busier section so that we can sort of explore and listen to some of the sound effects and just look. I love the fact that they did such a good job, just like GTA, where they go out and they make their fake brands. They made so many fake brands for this game, and once again, they nailed it. They did it did bump them. I was hoping I wouldn't bump them. They did a really good job. They nailed it. They made sure that all of those fake brands feel realistic. So I wanted to take you to one of my favorite spots in the game, and this is a place in the game where I always have to do that, where I feel like the game actually looks the way Mafia's developers planned it. What do I mean by that? Well, almost everything works here. There's a couple issues, but especially right now with the different colored lighting, and of course we know that they chose a palette that does actually, or is supposed to, invoke some feeling of nostalgia. You have this absolutely tremendously beautiful location, and it's right at the point to where you look and you walk around and you go, this is the way the game was probably supposed to look originally and without the dynamic weather. And unfortunately, many times it doesn't look near this good. So let's jump to a busier spot and maybe daytime here. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about NPCs and how they're generated in a game and what I see going on here. So generically, an NPC system will basically identify where the player is, and then it will spawn out characters that it takes from particular pools that fit that location and then put them in different places. One of the things I really like in Mafia 3, of course, is you have characters doing different things other than walking. You have them loitering, leaning up against buildings. It's something that I discussed in LA Noire as sort of missing and something that you notice as an increase here when we play Mafia 3. And so what I notice when you're playing Mafia 3 is that you actually get a little bit of a problem with retention with NPCs. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go into a new area and you sort of wait, sometimes the game sort of thinks, oh, this is an important thing, and it spawns a lot of NPCs in that location. Then if you sit there for just a small amount of time, they sort of meander about and leave, and you can end up being in a completely empty courtyard in the middle of noon. And this has happened multiple times. So let's listen to some audio around here. Yeah, so that drinking sample just kills me. You know, when you talk about how to make things more realistic, you really can't have a bump. You can't have a noticeable bump anywhere. Otherwise, it sort of breaks the gamer's attention. What happens there is you actually can hear where that recording took place. It took place in more of a studio than it did in the back of somebody's patio. And you can hear the glass and the person drinking far too closely than you ever should be able to. And you can adjust that with the mixer and it still doesn't actually fix it. One thing I found very interesting is that audio director Matt Bauer actually stated that while they do a lot of their mocap and a lot of their recording and audio in a studio there, the studio actually has a ton of problems and reflections. And he stated that the company has tried to fix that and has continued to fix it, but that they actually have to do an incredible amount of rescue. Now, what that means is audio rescue. They are using RX5 Audio Editor, which you can look up, and it is basically software purely for rescuing bad audio, which actually seems a little bit realistic here because you certainly do hear at times problems with the audio system. And it's very unfortunate that a massive company like this is having a problem in their studio, but it's something he was very open in admitting that they had a problem there. And when they were recording, they had multiple issues and they basically, they had to sit back and just do a ton of repair on that audio. And I think you notice it. This is such an interesting place to me, as I'm sure I've told you guys in other videos of some kind. My father owned a fish plant for 27 years, so walking past that and seeing the reinforced bars on the ramp for you to gain traction as you roll up, it was just really cool. It really brought me back home. This is, of course, one more area where the merchant just left. We see this in a lot of the different locations, a lot of the different stores where the merchant's nowhere to be found. They're not in the back because there's actually a back room you can go check. They just literally aren't there. It's almost like they don't spawn correctly. So here, once again, you've got the raised bridge there, and you've got the homes underneath it. Just absolutely stupendous. It's one of the things that I think that they did a really good job with their kits in making it feel like every house is enterable. Now, another thing, and I'm sure most people don't know this, but in 1960s, there were a lot of different ready-cut homes. There was like the Aladdin, let's see, there Meadowbrook, I think was one, Brookfield. I'm pretty sure Monterey was another. And these were like Better Homes and Gardens built homes that you could get that were basically people would come and build these homes for you. And it's great to see that they've sort of mimicked that in Mafia 3 to sort of give you an idea that in 1968, a lot of these places are that way. But they did such a good job with variation. You know, there's, as I spoke about straight lines, there's just very few in the game. So let's go a little bit, jump in a car here and go to a smaller, different location in town. What's this truck doing here? So, okay, let's just go here. Here's another thing that I really like. When you're exploring in Mafia 3 and you're exploring in GTA 5, two games that I think do this the best, there's always something there. There's always some little mystery. And we see that here with these people just talking in this truck parked under. You're like, what exactly is going on? What type of drugs you guys selling? And it's a unique mix there. It's like the chick, the dude in the freaking business suit, and then some hippie looking guy probably selling them weed. Very cool. Actually, you know what? There is I believe there's a football stadium. So we'll try to get to the football stadium. we take so many things for granted, but the reflection of monetary status is really, really well defined in this game, especially when you consider that it's not only money that separates the rich and the poor, it's also living conditions, where they live, and how close they live to inconveniences. For example, here we sort of start to see the slums, and on the left here you've got some large operation. Hell, it might even be some way connected to the fish plant, maybe a packing plant, but you see this industry on the left and you see the homes right there close on the right, and there's a really good reflection of the two next to each other, and you can see that mending of different influences all the way through the lower income locations that are in Mafia 3 that do a really good job of sort of making it feel solidified. And of course, as we know, they actually sent their art teams to New Orleans to take pictures, hundreds and thousands of pictures of the locations to sort of get that real lived in feeling. Once again, nothing straight here. You go back into these locations and there's almost never not something going on. You go back here and it actually looks like there's a poker game. So you see, oh, actually this might be a bad guy in a poker game. So you see these guys in a poker game. There's always something interesting occurring. And while it may not be up to GTA 5 standards, I think it's pretty damn close. It's actually one of those things where I would have to go and play both, but I really love just the overall look of all of this. And I have to say, it's continually impressed me in Mafia 5, the variation that they have on texturing when it comes to transitions between, let's say, a grassy area and the sidewalk, and how they handled all of that. It's very well done. It's so well done, in fact, that a lot of times it's really hard to see anything artificial. It's one of the reasons, again, why Mafia 3 is just so puzzling as a title, because you have such an amazing amount of low-level groundwork. You have 9,000 plus sound samples for the Foley systems, where they actually went and they got sound effects from the locations. They have, days and days that they spent taking pictures in New Orleans and getting all of this done and creating this incredibly interesting, varied, dynamic world. And then they have issues with the general overall interactivity itself. Hey, who knows? Maybe it'll be a DLC where it's called Go In and Buy Yourself a Hot Dog DLC. I'm not quite sure. But yeah, so here's the stadium. I wanted to show you guys this. It's just a really cool breakup of the location itself, and then going in here and seeing this. Now, I'm not quite sure if any place has a concrete stadium like this, because the first time I saw it, it reminded me of like the Roman Colosseum in the Gladiator movie. But you still have this situation where you actually have a stadium with real grass on the ground. It's not artificial like we see in some games. Of course, this is 1968, so that makes sense. But you know what I mean. They would still texture it to make it look like it was pretty much artificial. And here, they did a very good job. Let's talk about animations for a second. Yeah, so animations are definitely hit and miss. There are some really, really good ones. There are some really great animations. I like the way he puts his head down and you can actually see him roll onto the front of his toe as he pushes off for his run, especially in slow motion. But you certainly do see issues, especially when you're changing height in different places. We just saw that coming down those steps. Now, a lot of times when you're on steps, the game actually mends that animation fairly well, but you do notice when coming down, sometimes the game just decides that for whatever reason, you're dropping a higher amount than you actually are, and it'll put you into basically the fall animation, which is really odd. So let's do a bit of driving so we can talk a little bit about how they handled vehicles. So vehicles in Mafia 3 are such a mixed bag. I actually really like the control. I'm not a big fan of some of the looks of the fake cars, but one thing that surprised me is how they handled the audio for cars, and what I think ended up being a real travesty, which is the fact that they use Dynapack. What that is basically, it's a little bit like any kind of dyno where you put a car up and you can drive it and you can record the sound of the car without the car actually going anywhere. And so you remove a lot of the road noise and things like that, which is actually great. But what surprised me is then the audio director stated that they just randomly decided that each car needed to sound more unique. Now, I know a lot of people are like, whoa, wait, what? Especially car fans, because there is a subtlety to each vehicle and there's that difference in sound that you can get with each vehicle. Additionally, when you look at how humans work, we have a tendency, especially when we decide to systematically change a bunch of things, that we aren't as good as real life in being natural, right? We aren't as good as real life in being different. We have a tendency to use things that we have heard before, systematically create sounds that we may not know that we're subconsciously doing it, but we might be leveling things, which is exactly what happened here, where you lose the mid and the lower bass. You actually lose a lot of piston sound at times, which is quite sad. The vehicles really are anemic in this game, bar none. One of the worst vehicle sounds I've heard, and unfortunate because it sounds like they actually did a lot of work. But sometimes you just have to look at people and say, quit fucking meddling with something, and they did, and you just have really, really anemic vehicle sounds. I was not planning on crashing here, so give me a second here. So I decided one of the things I would do is run you guys a little bit through just the AI and how it reacts to particular things. And so what we have is a little bit of a mission here, and we're just going to go ahead and go do it randomly and see how the AI reacts to, well, whatever I end up doing while I play. I love this location with the 3 levels, the river going underneath the railroad, and then the railroad on top of the road itself. You can see that almost, oh crap, everything isn't built exactly the way it should kind of situation. Now, I've been asked my thoughts on the trains and if maybe Mafia 3 was supposed to have trains actually be usable at one time. It certainly does appear so. I've ended up walking almost all of the train tracks or driving vehicles and looking. There's a couple places where it looks like they might actually be fake, but many actual locations look like they're fully on modeled. And sometimes you can see, especially if you've followed games long enough, you can see where something looks like just a static model versus, let's say, an interactive model. You see that in various games like, let's say, Arma. We see it, of course, sometimes in a GTA or even in Mafia, where you'll have a car that you sort of look at and you're like, I definitely can't interact with that. There certainly does seem to be an interaction that's possible with the railroad tracks at some point. Certainly, I would hope to see that in a patch. We'll have to see. I'm not quite sure. I did end up spending time in one of the railroad stations, and they didn't have segregated lines. They didn't have lines that moved at all, actually, which really surprised me. It was pretty shocking how little they actually did in that kind of location. So here we go. We're going to take these guys out sniper style. I love this gun. It's definitely one of my favorite guns. Just nice, quiet. I mean, unrealistically quiet. It's like shooting ping pong balls at somebody and hoping that they'll die. But hey, you know, whatever. This is one of those locations where the rain and everything and the lighting and the impact, it actually looks pretty good, where it doesn't look too terrible when you have a dynamic weather system going at this exact time. Except you do have the fire in the sky, as I've stated multiple times. That's just a situation where they chose a certain color palette. Again, as I stated in the past, there's sort of a nostalgic connection. You can look up on color theory and you can identify what particular colors are supposed to do to particular people and their emotions. I feel that it's far too drastic. Let's take these dudes out. See if he reacts. Oh, yep, he did. It's like, my friend's dead. Oh, he reacted pretty quick. And they fell. All right. Just take these dudes. Whoa! Oh, an alligator. Now, I do like little subtle touches, like your character's jacket being wet, even though wet and leather look nothing like that, or even canvas, whatever he is wearing. It's does sort of look goofy, but overall, still pretty well done. Reach out and touch somebody with this gun, despite the fact that it's a silenced weapon and it's got a super short barrel. It's actually pretty good for reaching out and touching somebody. Hitting their turn-off switch. Removing their decision juice. Looks like we're going into dawn here. Oh, there's a guy right there. I didn't even see him. And you're dead. Right. Oh, that alerted some people. Well, let's just see what their patterns are.
We just lost a man! Fine, let's look someplace else.
It's really strange to me. The more you play it, the more you see the AI and its decision making, and you see at times it actually does very well, and then at other times it completely sort of falls apart, and it leaves you wondering exactly what you're doing to cause it to get confused. Like sometimes you have to sit back and go, did I just do something? Can it not see me? It certainly doesn't appear as if it's impacted in any way, shape, or form by weather like you are. That guy just went around there. Damn it.
You ain't ever gonna be free from me, boy.
Okay, he's out. So the AI in these kind of games, especially with a sniper rifle, there's only a certain amount that you can expect. And I think that what we get is fairly basic AI. At times, there's no problems. And then at other times, it completely fails. So it is just one of those, let's end his life. Sorry, buddy. It's just one of those games. It's an open world game, right? This is such a spectacular looking location. It, again, breaks up the eye. This is a kudo to whoever put this location together. They really make it interesting and make you go like, what's going on here and there, including that incredibly poor reflection on that ground. Man, some of the special effects in this game are just questionable. So I think I'll clean up these guys and then I'll go steal the boat and deliver the weed. One of the things that I really find interesting in Mafia 3 is their mission setup. None of their missions are overtly long, number one. It doesn't matter if it's a primary, secondary, or tertiary mission. In this case, tertiary, of course, meaning optional. But you have this situation where most games, the optional missions are almost collectibles, right? They're not too long. They don't take a long time to do, and you can get through them. And then your main and secondary missions are usually longer and longer. That's pretty much development in a nutshell for the most part, though you will see some variation there just due to how a mission plays out. What's really strange to me is that Mafia 3 is not like that. Mafia 3, for the most part, the secondary missions are the longest. Now, I don't mean the longest as in you can't get buried down into something in the single or secondary mission types and take longer. I just mean overall, their time with you just traveling around the world delivering pot actually usually takes a little bit longer than, let's say, going in and killing one guy and leaving. And I've always wondered about why they chose it. And I think that that's a real strength to Mafia 3. I think that it really does lend a uniqueness to Mafia 3 that necessarily, even though it's repetitive, doesn't feel the same way as other open world games. Even if originally you think it does, even if you sit back and say, yeah, it's pretty repetitive. What is funny to me is I found the secondary missions sort of a palate cleanser. And the tertiary missions even much more so. Sorry, it's very difficult to talk and drive this goddamn boat. So I found them this palate cleanser where I was doing those main missions and I was killing and I was finding out the stories and I was bouncing from place to place. And then suddenly I'd go and I'd deliver some weed or I'd go and steal a truck from somebody. And I felt that those were just really good setups because also what they do, if you look closely, those are there to allow you to explore the game world really in two ways. One, places you will never see and shortcuts you'll never see because of the way the main missions are set up, just simply due to their locations. But secondarily, also allowing you to explore, maybe find shortcuts, maybe find places you want to go, maybe find places you just want to explore, maybe find places where there's something secret and hidden. And there's a difference there between like an Assassin's Creed game with its collectibles and this game with its side missions sort of having you just drive around and explore. It's really cool as a palate cleanser. It doesn't mean it's for everybody, but I actually enjoyed the difference. And it's something that as I've talked to gamers, most gamers just didn't even notice it. They were like, okay, yeah, tertiary missions are there, option side missions, whatever you may call them. And then all of a sudden, when we started talking about their length and how, at least when it comes to the travel time and just sometimes, going all the way out, depending on where you steal the boat and going all the way out to pick up the weed, it can take a long time. And suddenly you see sort of that light in their eyes is like, oh man, that's true. Like they are a little bit longer, or they do feel a little bit different in the way that they're set up. And I think that once again is a boon to Mafia 3 and how it's designed. So as you guys will know, I've got to have the radio off because I'm not 100% sure, especially on long-term driving around like this, if I would get a copyright strike. One thing I really found interesting about the radio is it will fade out if you go inside of tunnels, and it'll fade out more and more as you get deeper into the tunnel and then start to fade back in as you get in. Also, they've discussed the fact that the radio doesn't stop. So now we've seen this in other games. They sort of made a big deal out of it. But of course, if you get out of your car and it was playing, for 3 minutes while you're out killing people, if you jump back in, it will have traversed past that. It will have moved on. The radio stations are basically 24/7 and they play continually whether you're listening or not, that's actually pretty cool. It was pretty interesting to see how they went about it. And of course, just the little bits of how they decided, like when you hit something, it sort of fades out and it's almost like, I wouldn't say an ears ringing kind of thing, but it's where it sort of affects your hearing and then it fades back in as you continue to play. They did a pretty good job with the radio system. The ability to have it interfered and stuff like that adds a little bit of realism to it. I'm not 100% sure most even noticed. And here we come with a weather system. Yeah, so the weather system certainly is a mixture of different systems all running at the same time. You have that color switch, and then of course you have the particle systems for the rain. We don't see, for the most part, any other kinds of real storm systems. So I haven't seen any hail or any snow, and that would make, of course, sense in this game. You do see things like slowly over time, little bits of water accumulating in different areas. Those aren't affected by gravity, so there's the occasional time where you see a curvature where there shouldn't really be a water puddle, and there is. But they did a pretty good job with that. The issue really here is the fact that that dynamic system really just ends up messing with everything that occurs and goes on here. So let's deliver this sucker. Oh. And of course, all tire modeling is done, including any weather-affected patterns. That's very cool. So, of course, everything gets worse if it's rainy or if you're on mud. There's been times where I've been in a sports car and went down a hill in the Outback area and tried to get out of a location and couldn't because the car was just spinning out of control. So let's move on to one last location. Okay, so that didn't work out so well. I ended up driving here and jumping out of that car. It flipped over, and I think it killed a bunch of people. But I wanted to take us to a really, basically one of the most urban areas, so we can sort of walk around and look at some of it, look at some of the variation, and then we'll go ahead and call this one over. Talking about the destruction mechanism within the game, just the destruction mechanics throughout. You know, we do see some limited destruction in various locations. We do see a couple things that can be impacted by grenades. Of course, we see there with the cars and some different parts of the cars that can come off. It is certainly, I think, about GTA 5 or a little bit lower level. It's not at a high level, which most people would want in a game, but this is an open world game, and keeping track of that many things is actually quite difficult. As everybody understands, you know, you have 512 megabytes of memory for the Xbox 360, even less for the PS3, and those did GTA 5 fairly well. And then you jump up to these new ones, and those GTA games were based, when we saw it on the Xbox One and the PS4, on the prior game, so they didn't really take advantage. But we do see what looks like Sleeping Dogs 2 trying to take advantage of some of this higher memory footprint, and hopefully we'll see it as well in future games here. But I wouldn't say that Mafia 3 really takes advantage of the new systems at all either, especially when it comes to anything like their memory footprint. When you look at a game like Mafia, it's certainly going to be a learning lesson for a lot of different developers who have nothing to do with the people who made this game. And regardless of the DLC, regardless of patches, regardless of what exactly occurs, regardless of anything, there's going to be a lot of people looking at Mafia 3 who desire to make open world games, and you're going to come away with a list of things you should and shouldn't do, or things that you want to try, or things that you think did or didn't work in Mafia 3. As a developer, that's really how somebody ends up learning. In many ways, it's just like somebody who wants to write has to read. You can't really study, you can't really create in a vacuum without at some point understanding what genre, what kind of thing you're wanting to create, and where do you want it to fit anyway. Mafia 3 really has a lot of positives and negatives to show developers. One of the positives, of course, is the world itself and the variation and the architecture and the amount of research that went into it. I mean, like I said, the better homes and gardens cut homes, the different variations where nothing is in a straight line in some of the more rural locations, and how everything sort of fits together. It's fantastically well done. There's a lot to be said there. I also think, despite some of the issues that even I've noticed, the NPC system is actually fairly well done as well. And it's really interesting. It's varied. And I like the fact that the NPCs can do random things like sit down at tables, lean against walls, little things that a lot of people don't really realize until they're gone or until they're missing. And then it looks like everybody's just floating above the game world doing nothing. However, there are some issues. And I think, you know, if you ignore the optimization issue, because we already know there's a problem there, if we ignore the bugs overall and just look at the systems themselves, I think really one of the major issues is the dynamic weather system. I think the dynamic weather system, regardless if you like it or don't, the fact is that it usually to the game does more harm than good, and ends up causing far more problems and far more ill looks than it ever should have. It really does feel like you have that static system not wanting to allow the dynamic system to change its overall color values and lighting values, and you get some really crazy stuff going on there. Additionally, it's far too fast. The weather system in this game is insanely fast. We've seen everything from people walking out, it's raining, walking around a corner, and suddenly it's sunny. We've even seen situations where it looks like the sun rises in 1 second. There's all kinds of problems there, and I think the dynamic system is one of those that I would have loved to have seen them just pull out of the game and, you know, decide on their own what the weather needed to look like from moment to moment, and then sort of fix those up as they went. I would say also here, you know, this interactivity or lack thereof, it's like you have 2.5 steps, and every gamer who plays is expecting that third step. You get into some of these and then you really can't do anything in them ever. And I think that if we just had that one extra step, I don't mean buying antiques, but I mean most of the stores where you can buy food, you can't do anything, those kind of things would really, really increase the overall presentation of the title. But when you look at Mafia 3 and you look at, like, did it actually match up with the PR and with the representations there? And I would say no, in many ways it really didn't. Sadly, it didn't. Whether it be the trailers, I did a trailer analysis on what they told me was real time on a console, and then I did that mission later and it looked nothing like it. I mean, it looked nothing like it. It was a huge downgrade in graphics. And it's unfortunate. You just have this problem where Mafia 3 will, whether it does great or not, it's going to be remembered as a game that was ultimately incredibly buggy, incredibly glitchy. And for many people, even if they liked it, like myself, I really enjoyed the story. I really enjoyed a lot of aspects of it. Even if you did like it, it certainly is not one of those titles where you can just say it's a classic or anything like that. It's far from it. I think the best you could say is that it's a pretty good game. And that's really sad because the amount of time they put into it should have been higher. This lady has the patience of Job. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys like this video. This one was a hard one. They have purposely kept a lot of the information about the development out. And so it was very difficult to find out even what engine this was truly running on, what version, if it was modified, what it was actually running on. So this has been one of the more difficult walking the walks, but also a very interesting one because I think a lot of work was put in on this game, but also 100%, I actually feel like the game was not planned to be released when it was. It certainly feels like it is 6 months early. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Peace out. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Got 2 boys in the state.
You don't say.
Huh? If I were you, I'd keep moving.